Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this UCL Lunch Hour lecture on why sharing meals can make people happier. So my name is Marco Ranaldi, and I am an assistant professor in economics at UCL. And it is my honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Alberto Prati. Alberto Prati studied econometrics and philosophy before pursuing his PhD in economics. He's currently a lecturer in economics at UCL, where he teaches how to combine economic methods and psychological concepts to answer public policy related questions. He also serves as a research fellow at the University of Oxford and is also an associate researcher at the London School of Economics. He studies various topics at the intersection of economics and psychology, including well-being measurement, opinion dynamics, and behavioral biases. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that we will have some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and this can be submitted at any point during the talk through the Slido platform. And by entering the event code sharing. So with that, I hand over to Alberto for his talk, and I look forward to listening to your presentation. Thank you very much for being with us, Alberto.
Thank you, Marco. Let me start by sharing the screen. Can you confirm that you can see the screen right? So thank you very much for the kind introduction. Lunch hour lecture, I can't think of a better place to talk about meals and in particular why sharing meals can make people happier. So the research that I will discuss was published a couple of months ago as part of the World Happiness Report. So I'd like to start by giving a few elements about what this report is. It's a report that is published every year since 2012, is published by University of Oxford with the support of the United Nations. And it started in 2012 because 1 year before, in 2011, the UN issued a resolution inviting member states to put happiness and well-being at the heart of public policy. So since then, every year, the World Happiness Report gather empirical research on happiness and well-being, trying to give a snapshot of what the global situation. Every year there is a different topic that is a thread connecting the different studies. In 2025, it was caring and sharing. So in recognition of the importance of sharing experiences, social connections, social support, trust, all these elements that we already know are fundamental for a well-functioning society. What is in practice the report about? Seems like a silly question. It should be about happiness, but actually not really. I would call it the World Wellbeing Report. The reason is that happiness in everyday English language, but also in social sciences, tend to refer to an ephemeral feeling, more an emotional state in the order of minutes or hours, while the focus of the report is broader, is about well-being. The following question is then, okay, it's about well-being, how do you measure well-being? And here there are two main ways of doing it. One is using objective measures. You can think of the poverty rate or the quality of the air or education level or the rate of suicides. All these are objective measures. Instead, by and large in the report, the focus is on subjective measures. Subjective measures are measures where people are asked how they feel. So are they satisfied with their life, satisfied with their work? Do they feel lonely? And based on this data, groups of researchers from different countries and different disciplines try to learn something and make progress in our understanding of well-being. More precisely, the measures that are a little bit the pillars of the report are the ones which are displayed on your screen. So the first two are quite similar. Life evaluation and life satisfaction are based on questions where people are asked to take a step back with respect to their life and say how satisfied they are with their life on a scale from 0 to 10. Most people are able to answer this question, and we know that these questions are not just noise, they correlate with what's going on in people's life and their actual behaviors. The other two questions, the other two measures, so positive affect and negative affect, refer to the more emotional side of things. So they are composite index where people are asked about their experience of enjoyment, worry, sadness, or anger the day before. So based on the analysis of this measure, we try to make progress on understanding how people are doing. Today's lecture is structured in two parts. So in the first part, I spend some time walking you through the research that I conducted myself in collaboration with Yann-Emmanuel Denève from Oxford, Andrew Dangan from Gallup, and Mika Katz from Harvard. And then in the second part, I will give you an overview of some other key findings from the 2025 report. So without further ado, let me move into the first part, which is about sharing meals. Now, sharing meals is, quite an understudied measure. Why social scientists should care about sharing meals? But there are actually good reasons. As social scientists, we are interested in measuring social connections. And the link between the social ritual of coming around a table and social connections goes actually very back in time. So a good example, I think, is the etymology of words. Think of the word companionship in English. It comes from Latin cum panis, literally means with bread. This is true also in other languages, in Italian, in French. We found out that it's actually true also in Chinese, where the word partner literally means fire mate, reflecting the idea of sharing a meal around a campfire. So this connection between the social ritual of sharing food and partnership, friendship, definitely is not something new, and definitely is also not something very specific to a culture or a country. On the contrary, virtually every culture, every country has some ritual and some connections to the fact of gathering around the food. From a social science perspective, the measure that we use, which is the frequency of sharing meals, so how often people share meals with people they know, is actually particularly appealing because it offers a concrete, tangible behavior that measures social connections. So it's to some extent an objective measure. We do not observe it. People report themselves how often they engage in this habit. But it has an important advantage with respect to some more traditional measures, which are more subjective. So people could be asked, how many friends do you have? But the concept of friendship tends to change quite a lot from person to person. Or do you feel supported? But this is also a perception that tends to change from person to person. Now, subjective measures are great. I work a lot with them, and they can be very useful. But there are good reasons that make very difficult to study the relationship between two subjective measures. So if we have subjective well-being measures on the one hand, it's important that we have something tangible and concrete on the other hand, if we want to understand the connection between the two. And this is one of the important appeals that brought us to engage with this measure, sharing meals. This is an empirical research, so it's based on actual data. What is the data? Well, in 2022 and 23, the Gallup World Poll, which is a the only annual global survey, collected global information about sharing meals. That is to say, it asked the respondents the following question: how many lunches and how many dinners did you share with someone you know during the past week? Could be colleagues, friends, or family. This data is from over 150,000 people from 142 countries and territories. So if you're thinking about a country, it's likely that it's in this data set. And when you pull this, this number of lunches and number of dinners together, we have a measure that goes from 0, if the person didn't share any meal during the past week, to 14 if they shared every lunch and every dinner. So for the first time, we could create a global map of sharing meals, of this social ritual around the world. And this is how the map looks like. So the lighter colors refer to lower number of shared meals during a week, and the dark blue color refers to a higher number of shared meals on average in that particular country. So the first thing that comes quite clearly is there is quite a lot of variation. So you go from the light green of India, Japan, South and East Asia in general, where on average people share about 1 meal out of 3, to the dark regions in Latin America, like Paraguay, Colombia, and Ecuador, where on average people share 2/3 of their meals. So quite a lot of differences across countries and geographical areas. But what we were interested in is, can we learn something about well-being from these differences? Now, it turns out that in countries where people tend to share more meals, life evaluations on average tend also to be higher. Of course, there are so many things changing from one country to the other that, this is just suggestive. But then when you look within each country, even within each country, people who tend to share meals more often tend to report higher level of life evaluation. And even when we take into consideration various factors that could explain these differences, such as differences in age, in income, in gender, in the fact of living alone or with family, even once you partial out all these factors, the relationship still holds strong. Now, we expected to have some relationship. We hoped that there would have been some relationship between social ritual of sharing meals and well-being. But what is staggering is the strength of this relationship. And I would like to show you a couple of graphs to give you a sense of how strong this relationship is. So the first one is, this set of graphs on the right-hand side, which gives you the following information. If I ask a person how many lunches and dinners they had with someone they know during the past week, how much am I learning about their well-being? And it turns out that I'm learning as much as if I was asking what's their income band. Now, income together with unemployment is one of the key socioeconomic determinants of life evaluations. So the amount of information contained in this very simple question, this very simple behavior, tends actually to be very high. So the bars that you see on the screen reflects the statistics, which is known as R-squared, and which gives essentially this information, the amount of variation in life evaluation and in positive affect that is explained by just the information about shared meals or just the information about dining alone for the whole week. And dining alone in particular seems to be a very strong predictor of well-being. Knowing if someone has shared at least one meal during the last week tells us more about their well-being than knowing if they are unemployed This is both in terms of positive affect or life evaluation. So the amount of information is very rich. Another type of exercise that we can run is using regression analysis to see how much, if we add 1 extra shared meals during the week, how much life evaluation improvement and positive affect improvement we can expect. And this is the information that is contained in the graphs which are displayed. There is a lot of information, so I invite you to focus on the circle part, which is the world average. So what does this dot in correspondence with the world average tell us? It tells us that if we compare people who always dine alone to those who shares all their meals, on average, we observe a difference of about 0.4 points in their life evaluation. The life evaluation goes from 0 to 10. 0.4 seems small, but it's actually very big. So it is comparable to the predicted effect of doubling one's income or moving out of unemployment. So these are world averages, and the fact of moving from not having meals with anyone to always sharing meals predicts very big differences in people's well-being. In the graphs, you can see that there are many dots and many lines actually, and the name of different world regions. So what the graph shows you is the different effects that we estimate in different areas. So, different world regions have different life satisfaction levels and different levels of shared meals, but also the relationship between the two changes from a world region to the other. And in some areas, this relationship is particularly strong. If you see North America, Australia, and New Zealand comes out consistently as having a particularly strong link between sharing meals and the well-being variables. And this inspired the second part of the research, which was a focus on North America. Now, why a focus on North America? Because what we would have loved is to know how these habits have changed over time. Are people sharing more meals today with respect to some time ago? How are these things evolving? But the global data set that we use, it's only available for 2022 and 2023. So instead, we needed to focus on some specific countries. And in the United States, the American Time Use Survey has been collecting data on meals habits for over 20 years. So people report some daily agenda where they explain what they did and with who. We now have 20 years of data where we can see how the habit of sharing meals has evolved over time. We focus on a particular concept, which is the one of dining alone, that we define as reporting eating alone all meals in the previous day. So how has this changed? Similar to 20 years ago, improved, increased, decreased. You can see this from the graph. So this upward trend shows you the percentage, the proportion of people who are eating all of their meals alone. And as you can see, this is definitely increasing over time. So it moved from around 18% 20 years ago to 10 percentage point more in 2023. So very clearly, Americans are spending more and more time dining alone. And this seems symptomatic of disintegration of a social ritual, which is very important in particular in this world region. Now, there are the question that comes after is, why is this happening? And it's not easy to answer, but what we can say is that it's not just driven by the fact that people tend to live alone more often. This is also true. More and more people are living alone, but this explains only up to 20% of this upward trend. An aspect that turns out to play a very important role is the one of age. So when we slice the data by age, it turns out that young adults are really the ones which are driving this trend. And this is explained in the graph that is displayed, where you see different lines going a little bit up and down, but tends to go up. And I invite you to focus on the black continuous line. This is the line that tells you the change from 2003 all the way to 2023 in the 18 to 24-year-old. And you see that it ends at 1.9. What does this 1.9 mean? It means that today, the 18 to 24 years old are 90% more likely to share no meals on a single day than those of the same age group did in 2003. So quite a staggering increase in the proportion of young adults that do not share meals with others. Now, in some years, the American Time Use Survey, pretty amazingly, actually asked also people to report how they felt during the day. So not only what they did and with whom, but about their emotions. And this allows us to look at how these emotions experienced during a day compare among those who dined alone and those who shared meals. And in this case, again, there is a significant difference. People dining alone are more likely to experience stress, pain, and sadness than those who shared at least one meal with someone else. So again, indicative of this connection between feeling and sharing meals. And moving for a second away from the American perspective, moving back to a global perspective, I find this graph particularly staggering because it says something about social support. So people around the world in the Gallup World Poll were asked the following question: do you have someone to count on in times of need? And those who didn't share any meal last week are much less likely to have someone to count on in times of need. So the world average is around 80%, but it's 10 percentage points less for those who didn't share any meal. So indicative of the fact that this is also about social isolation and not just about a habit which is a free choice. This is what I wanted to tell you for the study about sharing meals. What did we learn? So I think we learned that rethinking how we gather around the table, break bread together, this could provide practical solutions to help reduce social isolation and enhance well-being. You might wonder, okay, at the end of the day, this sharing meals or not is an individual choice. So this is not really up to institutions. But I think this would be downplaying the role of institutions. Take the example of UCL. What could UCL do to improve sharing meals? Well, my suggestion is that it could be a little bit more like Hogwarts. Have you ever seen Harry Potter dining alone in a corner? No, but not because Harry Potter is particularly extrovert, but rather because there is a social norm at Hogwarts, the one of coming to big dinner tables and lunch tables and sit one close to each other. Now, magic and wizards apart, this actually happens also in the real world. So there is a lovely tradition in many colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, which is for lunch, faculty and student, when they enter the dining hall, sit close to each other. So faculty close to their colleagues, students close to their fellow students. And it's actually very rude to not do so. And these create some social connections and conversations that would actually be hard otherwise to create. And I think it's a good example of how social norms, small changes in how the space is organizing and what the rules are, can create environments which are conducive to strengthening the social ties and through sharing meals. This is true not only in universities, but also in other workplaces. Let me conclude with a caveat, which is probably the main limitation of this study. So there is more research to be done. This is always the case for every research. And the main limitation in this case is that the causal dynamic is not clear. So there is a bit of a chicken-egg problem. We do not know if people who feel better tend to reach out to other people more to ask them out for lunch, or people feel better because they went out for lunch with other people. It's very likely that both things are happening, but to measure how much is one versus the others, we need experimental data. This is work in progress. Maybe I'll come back in some years with more about it. Now, I could talk about this project for hours, if not days, but you're lucky enough for me to stop about this project. And instead, I thought it would have been a good idea to walk you through some of the findings from the 2025 World Happiness Report, some of the findings from other teams and other colleagues. The report is more than 300 pages long, so I cherry-picked some elements that I think are particularly thought-provoking and hopefully are going to spark your curiosity to go and check the report yourself. The first study I wanted to mention is about perceived benevolence. This is a collaboration of a Canadian team. And what do I mean by benevolence? By act of benevolence, we mean something like volunteering or helping a stranger or donating money. But here I would like to focus on a specific aspect, which is the fact of returning a wallet. So people around the world were asked the following question. If you lose a wallet, do you think it's going to be returned either by a neighbor or a stranger or by police? And the answer to this question actually correlates, again, pretty well with life evaluation. That is to say, in countries where life evaluations are particularly high are also countries where people expect their fellow citizens, their community, to make this act of kindness and return the wallet. Now, from this relationship, there are two questions, two ramifications that can be explored. The first one is, are people deluded? Is it actually the case that the wallet will be returned? And is it true that, in Finland, people really expect their fellow citizens to return the wallet? Is it true that it's more likely in Finland than in the UK for this wallet to be returned? The question can actually be answered thanks to a fascinating study by Kohn and co-authors, which was published in Science a few years ago, where they literally went around cities, dropping wallets with or without money, and then recorded the rates of return of the wallet. And it turns out that in countries where the perceived rate is the highest are also the countries where the actual return rate is the highest. So these are the Scandinavian countries and Switzerland. So there is some correspondence between perceived benevolence and actual benevolence, but there is a very important but, which is there is a perception gap. And I think this is explained clearly by this graph, where you see at the center bar indicates the expected likelihood of a wallet being returned. This data is from Canada. So in Canada, people expect that, well, there are 25% chances of the wallet be returned. One person out of 4 will actually do it. When you test it and drop wallets, the actual likelihood is 3 times higher. 75% of wallets are returned, so 3 people out of 4 return it. And I think there is some hopeful message in these findings. That is to say, we tend to be a little bit too pessimistic about how kind the fellow citizens, the members of our community, can be toward us. And there is some scope for narrowing this perception gap. And actually, narrowing a perception gap is the focus of another study from the World Happiness Report that I would like to mention. And the gap here is about empathy, the perceived empathy, and how this can improve social connections among students. I expect many people in the audience to actually be students. So the research comes from a team at Stanford, and what they did is that they tested different interventions to try and promote social connections on campus. Let me mention 2 of these interventions. So in the first one, they went in half of residential halls in Stanford, putting posters in the hall, posters that inform students about the empathy of other students. So you see some examples of the posters on your display. The information given is something like 95% of Stanford students are likely to help others who are feeling down, or 85% of Stanford students enjoy meeting new friends. And students who were in the residential halls where these posters were displayed actually had a higher expectation of the empathy of their peers, and they were slightly more likely to reach out to strangers. So the type of problem that this research approaches is the risk that in our residential halls, like in many situations on campus, you could have students who are very willing to go. They would like to meet other people, but they think that the people are not interested. And since everyone thinks this, nothing happens. It is a bad equilibrium, an economist would say. So this type of intervention can help narrowing the expectation gap, but the second intervention actually was even more effective, and it's based on the idea of subtle nudges sent through messages that students received on the phone. The experiment went the following way. Many psychology students, actually probably not only psychologists, but yeah, Stanford students were recruited, and half of them were given an intervention based on trying to be more social in their attitudes. So every day they were receiving a message telling them, inviting them to do a little socially risky activity. This could be something like asking a friend out for coffee, or telling a friend that you appreciate something about them. And the researchers kept on surveying the people who were involved in the trials, including those who were involved in this specific nudge. And it turns out that these people were twice as likely to sign up for an actual social event with respect to the control group, and reported a higher number of close friends. So this seems to be lasting intervention, since the social connections which are created on campus can actually last for a while in the educational journey of the students. And the third and last study that I wanted to walk you through says something about how perception of trust has actually pretty practical repercussions in terms of who governs us, in terms of voting. This research was run by a group of French researchers based in Paris, and was based on a conceptual paradigm that can be very well summarized with the images that you see on the screen. So The data comes from 10 European countries, where people were asked the following questions. How satisfied are you with your life on a scale 0 to 10? How much do you think that people can be trusted in general on a scale 0 to 10? And who did you vote for at the last elections? And when you combine these three pieces of information, there is a pattern that comes out. And the pattern is the following. People who tend to be more satisfied with their life than the average person in their country tend to vote for more moderate parties, while people who are less satisfied with their life tend to vote for more anti-system populist parties. But the distinction between left and right doesn't come from less satisfaction, it comes from the level of perceived trust. People who report higher level of trust in others tend to vote more left-wing. Those who report lower trust in others tend to vote more far-right or right. So this says something about the concrete practical repercussions of perceived trust and the importance of having a realistic account of what the situation in the country is in terms of benevolence and trust. This brings me to the conclusions, and I'm well in time. So what are the conclusions? Other people matter. We already knew this, but looking at concrete data from different perspectives, different perceptions, different social rituals, such as the one of sharing meals, can help us understand what we can do to try and improve the social fabric of our society. The studies from the World Happiness Report show us that what people perceive matters. So how kind we think other people are, how much we trust them. This has concrete repercussion on how our society is shaped. And then if I have to close with a recommendation, it's nice to have lunch on our own now and then, but if you don't have plans for lunch tomorrow, this is a good moment to just send a message to someone you would like to spend more time with, and you probably won't regret it. And I would like to thank you for your attention and move it to my host, Marco.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for this presentation that was super inspiring, extremely clear, and extremely interesting. And I always love when we have these global pictures of basic but fundamental questions put together and get sort of a world eye view of everything happening, especially for such important topics. So thank you very much for sharing all of this with us. I see already several questions, but feel free to add up more. I'm continuing monitoring them. So let me start with the first question from, well, all of them are from anonymous people. So why do you think Americans are eating alone more and more often? Do you think something similar is happening in the UK as well? Maybe we can do one question and then you can reply, and then we'll move to the next.
Spend the time, otherwise I will forget them. So it's very hard to know the reason why. We can't really say what's the reason, but what I can say is it's unlikely to be a recent trend. And I can say this because in a very influential book published about 20 years ago by Putnam, the book titled Bullying Alone, it was already documented that the frequency of sharing meals with family was declining from back in the 70s. So this seems to be a long-time trend, which is actually continuing over time. And I suspect that in the UK, this is very similar to be happening as well. Yeah.
Very interesting. And a follow-up question is the following one. So do meals with co-resident family members count as shared? And does this mean that dine alone largely overlaps with lives alone?
Very good question. Yes. So Both answers are yes. The first one is sharing meals with someone you know includes family, friends, colleagues. And of course, there is a strong correlation with the household arrangement. So people who live alone are more likely to dine alone. But in a statistical analysis, what you can do is try and control for this factor, therefore comparing people who are living alone with people who are living alone, and people who are living with a family with people who are living with a family, and see how the relationship with well-being holds, if it does hold, once you control for these factors. And this is one of the factors we took into account because it's an important one. Also, age is an important one. Elderly tend to dine alone more often than youngsters. So on average, elderly are also related to the living arrangement. The difference is that while elderly hasn't changed too much in their frequency of dining alone, youngsters now are dining alone much more often. So that the trend is driven by the youngsters. I hope
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, 100%, super clear. And actually, let me start with a follow-up question, which has just come up, which is, do you know why people started to stop sharing meals in the 1970s?
Very hard question. I would love to hear more about what the hypotheses are. So I have a conjecture for which, however, I don't have any data to be backed, so take it with a pinch of salt. But when you look at the global distribution of sharing meals and also at the relative effect, so where is it stronger? Where is the effect of the relationship between sharing meals and well-being stronger? It seems to be stronger in individualistic countries more than in collectivist countries. So the US, Australia are prime cases of individualistic countries versus Japan, typical collectivist country where the frequency of sharing meals is actually pretty low, but the connection with well-being is also pretty low. Why this? I suspect because it's one of the social rituals which keep on people connected in a very individualistic society. And the more we move toward individualism, the more renouncing to this social ritual can be harmful. But again, these are conjectures. So there is more research needed for actually backing this or discarding if it's not true.
Right. Well, of course, this cannot be a coincidence that somehow this trend started off with the, let's just like generalize this, the rise of neoliberal capitalism, which somehow imposed a new structure of labor market that induces people basically to spend more time by themselves. So yeah, anyway, there's room, as you were saying, for a lot of new research on this topic. Let me follow up with another question, which is, so is there a difference in well-being levels between those who share meal times with others and those who share food from their own plates with others? Can you recall any of this distinction from your data?
Question. I don't know. The I would love to know. I would love to know. It's often the problem of, there is a bit of a trade-off between trying to be as broad as possible, global. You're interviewing 150,000 people around the world. You will be able to ask only a couple of questions, which applies to all of them. And sharing the meal from the same plate is particular only in some, it's more common in some geographical areas than others. So I think a more in-depth focus on these areas could help learning more about it. I would love to know actually. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't give much of an answer on that.
Right. And just like let me now follow up myself on something I was thinking. Of course, I completely take this when you go global or when you go comparative, you absolutely need to be, just like as simple as possible so as to be able to compare simple statistics across so many people. But how about the income levels? So at individual income levels, I think, of course, you can correlate your findings with the country GDP per capita statistics, but is there anything about income that you can report, or maybe I missed something from the presentation?
So in this data set, people are asked about their income band, or in some countries about the actual level of income. Now, this data is always a little bit noisy, so the best way of treating it is typically by also accounting for the differences in wealth of the different countries, is by using the income quintile. A quintile is essentially the income band. So when we are analyzing this data, we are trying to compare, we are actually comparing not only people who live within the same country with a similar living arrangement, age and gender, but also people who are within the same income group, the income quintile. And also the graph that I showed about how much do we learn from sharing meals, what we did is we tried to explain life evaluation based on either the information on the income quintile or the information on the number of shared meals. We actually reduced the information on the number of shared meals to move it to 5 categories so that we could compare 5 categories against the 5 categories of quintile. But this gets a little bit too technical.
Right. Thank you. Another question is, what do you think is the role of loneliness in your findings? So about sharing meals and well-being. Of course, it's hidden, right? But what's your take on this?
I think it's very important because there is an important distinction between being alone and being lonely. And again, having lunch on your own could be very nice sometimes, but you're not lonely because you're choosing to do this. While loneliness is about a form of imposed being alone, which doesn't match with what we would like in terms of social connections. And luckily, in 2023, the Gallup World Poll asked a question about loneliness. Did you feel alone yesterday? I think was, did you feel lonely yesterday? I think was the wording of the question. And when you look at the correlation between the sharing meals and loneliness, it's again a very strong correlation. That is to say, people who didn't share any lunch or dinner the previous week report significantly higher levels of loneliness than those who share most of their meals. So it's not only a question of people not just choosing to be to having their meal alone, but it's also a question of how connected you are to the social network.
Right. And it's also part of the discussion on subjective and objective measures that you always want to strike a balance between the two when you look at relationship. Another follow-up question is, please, could you again share the book title you mentioned as response to your first question? So it ended with alone. You have it there. Fantastic.
It's Bullying Alone by Robert Putnam.
Oh,
this is the paper version. It was a very
perfect.
influential book that came out on the development of social capital. It's a focus in the US, and it takes different measures, the engagement in associations and different types of measure to show that there has been a progressive disintegration of the social fabric in the US. So title is Bullying Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community. I didn't remember the second part.
Okay, perfect. And there's one more question. It's about prediction here. So do you think more people will tend to have community meals in the future, despite the availability of fast food and the trend of eating and the go?
I hope this would happen.
After this presentation.
Yeah, honestly, given these results, this would be great. If nothing happens, and the trend documented in the US is at least as wide as the Western worlds, then no, if you don't steer the boat, this is the direction it's going. And also after COVID, there seems to be less and less space for these community meals. But what I want to underline, I already tried to do it in the presentation, is this is not only an individual part of things. So there is the individual thing of asking out a friend or a colleague tomorrow for lunch just to share and organize it. But there is also an institutional role. So providing space in workplaces where people are encouraged to share their meals and create these informal connections and enhance the sense of belonging in such an important place as where we're studying, where you're working. These, I think, are very practical, concrete solutions that could be implemented to help making community meals more common.
Yeah. And that's, I think, what's great and fantastic of this report is precisely that by providing this large-scale stylus facts on this super important topic, I mean, they give precise indications for policy, which can be really readily applicable in different contexts. I don't see other questions, but I have a question myself, so also to give more time to people to think and to take the chance of asking more question to Alberto. And I was actually, my question is that, I mean, it's not really technical, but something I would have loved to want to learn more, and which is related to something broader, which is, so very simple question is, when you look at the relationship between, of course, meal sharing and impact on life satisfaction, since you're taking into consideration so many countries, do you control for somehow cultural effects, which in practice could be related to the fact that in some countries you simply have less meals per week, and in other countries you have more meals. So do you standardize for this? And this is like a simple question to then ask a broader question, which is, how do we make sure that we are really controlling for cultural differences in these relationships at the very least?
So that's a very important question. I think there are two elements of the answer. One is sharing less meals could mean having less meals. Having less meals might mean not being able to afford the meals. The way that we try to control for this is by using another question in the survey where people are asked if they have enough money to comfortably provide food.
Mm.
So this is what allows us essentially to distinguish the case. But your question was more focused on the cultural aspect. And for the cultural part, what we do is, in statistics term, is country-fixed effects. In practice, it means that we're trying to compare things within countries, taking into account the average number of meals shared within the country, rather than not taking, rather than ignoring this difference. Now, does this account for the complexity of the cultural differences? No, it does not. But I think it's the best we can do, and probably I'm quite comfortable in thinking that we are controlling enough for these geographical differences in what could be the average, so that what we actually observe is mostly differences within societies.
Yeah, completely see your point. Thank you, Alberto. So I do not see any more questions. So let me wait a few more seconds to see whether we can collect some more before maybe concluding this lecture. Just like while you were talking about it, I was thinking about Ramadan, which is a very long period of the year for Muslim people, which is about a month. And of course, I mean, this is a drastic reduction of overall meals per person. So of course, if you say that you have been sharing, just like 7 meals over the last week, this implies that you've been sharing a lot during that month.
So an important part of Ramadan is exactly the fact of sharing the meals that then are taken between dusk and dawn, dawn and dusk, sunset and sunrise. And definitely, I think it's an excellent example of how a social ritual is so connected with the cultural aspect, the social ritual which revolves around food. So yeah, it's an excellent example.
Perfect. Okay, so I don't see any more questions. So let me conclude this lunch hour lecture by thanking Alberto for this amazing presentation and especially for just like speaking about this massive project on behalf of all of the community of scholars, many of which, of course, you have mentioned during your presentation about this super important topic. And of course, I encourage everyone to read the World Happiness Report, which, as Alberto was saying, is about 300 pages long. So you can find more information and you can even disseminate this information to other people. Before closing it, I want simply to remind everyone that the next lunch hour lecture is going to be on recent trends in smoking and vaping in England, and is going to happen next Thursday, the 29th of May, at 13 London time. So with that said, thanks again, Alberto, for your lecture. Thanks everyone for attending this lecture today, and I wish you all a nice rest of the day.
Thank you for joining. Thank you, Michael.